Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rosa Cabrera. I'm the director of the Rafael Cintron Ortiz Latino Cultural Center. Many of you call it the LCC. Thank you for joining us in the Zona Abierta. They were calling Unpacking Immigration and Disability Justice. And this is presented in partnership with the Disability Cultural Center. Both centers are part of the Centers for Cultural Understanding and Social Change. Here at UIC, these are 7 centers that work together to advance positive social change through the principle of inclusion, assets, and equity. How many of you are familiar with the cultural centers? Okay, great. Glad to see that. And who is new to Zona Abierta? Okay, a few of you. So let me just tell you a little bit about what Zona Abierta is. It's a program series of the Latino Cultural Center that highlights the intersection of the arts, humanities, science, culture, and civic life with presentation with local, national, and international artists, community leaders, and also a lot of people here from the university, mostly scholars. And what we try to do in Zona Abierta is to highlight pressing social and environmental issues that are affecting Latinx communities, but also people in Latin America, while we make connections across diverse communities here in Chicago and all over the world. And I always like to point out that this space that you're in today has a very rich history of bringing people together to talk about pressing issues, to share the creative solutions that people are using to resolve everyday challenges, and also to form coalitions for change. So there's the history here of about 43 years of this center doing this. So this history, and in particular this mural here, I always like to point out also that it makes this a site of conscience, un lugar de conciencia. Why do I say that? Well, because we are reminded about our histories every day and our past struggles, right, for social and environmental justice. But most important, we're challenged to really reflect on the present and to think about what are the solutions that we need to change to make this a better world for everyone to live in. So it's this connection of connecting the past to the present and the future. We're honored to have here with us today Katherine Perez, and she will be properly introduced in a minute or so, who will be our presenter and provide a critical perspective on how disabled immigrants have been increasingly affected by inhumane immigration policies that have been putting forward by the current administration. But before I give the floor to Margaret Fisk, who's the director of the Disability Cultural Center, I would like to thank our co-sponsors for this event, the Disability Resource Center. I think there are some people here. Yeah, great. And Latin American Recruitment and Education Service LATES program. Also CAN TV for taping the program. You can check CAN TV's website to find out when this presentation is going to be aired. But I also want to point out that if any of you is uncomfortable in being taped, this is sort of like the area that the camera is pointing to, so you might want to, change seats. It's fine to do that. We're also live streaming on Facebook because we just closed the gallery. We're full to capacity, but people are able to join us through Facebook. And lastly, some housekeeping information. This afternoon, the bathroom in this building is for all genders. And we also have fragrance-free hand soap brought to us by the Disability Cultural Center. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and I hope you enjoy the presentation.
Okay, good afternoon. As Wilda said, my name is Margaret Fink, and I'm the director of the Disability Cultural Center. And before we dive in, I wanted to just do an access check. So first of all, how are the lights in this room? Would it be helpful to turn them down or up? Okay, the lights are okay, great. What about the volume of the microphone? Is it loud enough? Is it too loud?
It's perfect.
Okay, no changes needed? Okay. And then also, in terms of the space, I know there's a lot of people in here, so let's just carve out some space right now. If you need to adjust spatially how things are set up, if you want to ask someone next to you to scooch forward or move over, or if you need to be closer to the aisle or something, let's take a minute, talk to your neighbor, and make the changes. Okay, all right, so I also want to invite you all, as much as you are able to, we are kind of crammed in here. Feel free to get up, move around, fan yourself, move your hands, stretch, leave and come back, whatever you need to do in order to be comfortable. Sometimes in an event like this, in non-disabled cultures, those kinds of things are frowned upon, but we want this to be as accessible a space as possible, and we invite you to do what you need to do to be comfortable. Okay, so as Rhoda mentioned, I'm the director of the Disability Cultural Center, and that's a new center on campus. Our mission at that center is to celebrate and affirm disability communities, foster social belonging, and to really join in this work of realizing that if we want to think about disability justice, we have to consider that it's something that involves thinking through how a whole lot of different identities intersect in order to effectively figure out how we promote social change. So, okay, now I have the pleasure of introducing Katherine Perez, our speaker for today. Katherine is an attorney and a legal scholar whose current scholarship is about the experiences of undocumented Latinx college students with disabilities. And she's been a leader and co-founder of the Disabled Latinx movement, and currently is serving as the director of the COELO, did I pronounce that correctly? COELO, COELHO, Center for Disability Law, Policy and Innovation at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. So we're really fortunate to have her with us tonight. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Any of you from Haley Gibbons' class? Nobody? She's in my PhD cohort, and she's my best friend. She told me she told her students to come, so none of them are getting extra credit. Anyway, thank you for having me. Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Lily. Thank you to both the Latino Cultural Center and to the Disability Cultural Center. It's really exciting that there is now a Disability Cultural Center at UIC. Hooray. So just a little bit of background before I dive in. I am the proud granddaughter of Mexican immigrants, though I am not an immigrant myself. I was going to say they came from Mexico, but I said Mexican immigrants. So I am a person with psychiatric disabilities. When I was younger, I didn't really identify as disabled. It was something that I kept very hidden from my family. We didn't talk about it. It was very stigmatized. But I did form a conscience for disability justice at a very young age because I have a sister who's a year younger than me and she has intellectual disability and then more recently has been diagnosed with autism. And so my first understanding of disability justice was as a sibling to someone who was disabled. And like I said, I was from the first memories that I have, someone who struggled with mental health or mental illness, but I didn't have the language to put that to connect myself to the disability community. And then at the end of high school, when I became suicidal and luckily did not succeed in committing suicide. My parents, I finally came out to my parents and they plugged me into the psychiatric system. And then I still did not identify as disabled. To me, I was someone with quote unquote mental illness. I was part of the psychiatry institution. I ended up becoming an undergrad in college in psychology, which I think is kind of typical, right, for undergrads. Self-discovery. College is a time of self-discovery. But still, I wasn't part of the disability community. It actually wasn't until I went to law school when I was 26 that I started learning about disability studies, critical disability analysis, disability pride, disability culture, the disability rights movement. Did I find out that people with mental illness are part of the disability community, and I started identifying. And so I use the word psychiatric disability intentionally, following in some of the reasons that Margaret Price, a disability scholar, has laid out. And one reason in particular is that saying psychiatric disability explicitly links me to the disability community. So, like I said, because you guys, any of you are students and undergrads, right? I'll tell you a little bit about my educational and professional journey. So I was a psych major for a lot of self-discovery. That was wonderful. But I did not want to become a psychologist. I ended up thinking I wanted to explore more of the policy world. So I got a fellowship through the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute, CHCI. The following year after I graduated college, and I worked for Congresswoman Linda Sanchez, and I loved my time there. And it was my time in Washington, D.C., working on Capitol Hill, that I started meeting a lot of attorneys. As you can imagine, like every other person on Capitol Hill is an attorney. I was the first in my family to graduate from college, so I didn't have attorneys in my family. Although since then I found out that I have like a distant cousin who is an attorney, so very proud of her. She's also queer too. I'm queer as well. I lost my train of thought. So I knew I wanted to be so then I figured out that I wanted to be an attorney. And let me back up. Even when I went into psychology, I knew I always wanted to pursue disability justice. That has always been my passion. I just didn't know how to apply it. So when I was on Capitol Hill, I figured out, I'm going to do policy and law around disability. This is how I'm going to apply it. So I need to go to law school. But before then, I wanted to do the Peace Corps. So it was just like this lifelong dream that I had. So I did the Peace Corps. I lived in Peru for 2 years. Got way more out of it than I could ever have given to anyone being a volunteer. And that is actually where I learned Spanish. I come from Los Angeles. I was born and raised there. And I'm from a generation where my parents, even though they spoke Spanish, didn't teach me Spanish, tragically. Maybe some of you can relate. And then after the Peace Corps, I went to UCLA School of Law. And when I went into UCLA School of Law, I knew that I wanted to do disability. Maybe that was going to look like being a disability attorney. But in the 3 years that I was at UCLA Law, they never offered a disability law course. But one unique thing at UCLA School of Law is that they offer critical race studies specialization in the law. And that was where I really learned about how to do critical analysis of the law. So not just to learn what the black and white letter of the law is. That's what we call just memorizing what the law is, the black and white letter of the law. What CRS was doing was we were looking at the history of the law, and we were doing a discourse analysis, and we were not only reading the cases, but figuring out who were the people in the cases and how obviously did race influence these cases and racism, right? And one of the many of you probably know what CRS is, but from a legal context, one of the main premises of CRS is that the law both constructs race and perpetuates racism. And so when I was in CRS, I thought, wow, we really need to do this for disability. We need to have a critical analysis of disability laws. Turns out there is something called disability legal studies, which is a critical analysis of disability laws, but you can probably count on one hand how many legal scholars across the nation do this kind of analysis. So, so I thought, you know what, I love school. After I graduate law school, I'm gonna go and get my PhD and study disability studies, because I wanted to have that critical understanding of disability that I didn't have in order to apply it to the laws. So that's why I ended up here at UIC in the Disability Studies program, getting my PhD. But at that point, I really just wanted to do a critical analysis of disability laws. And I wasn't really thinking through an intersectional lens, even though I had had the CRS training. And for those of you who don't know what intersectionality is, although I can't imagine many of you don't, intersectionality was first coined by a Black feminist, Kimberly Crenshaw, who I actually had as a civil rights professor when I was in law school. I'm always so mean, but I'll say this. I think sometimes some of the more brilliant scholars are not as good as teachers. So anyway, Kimberly Crenshaw. She's great. Her theories are great. So she coined the term, of course. People are talking about intersectionality way before Kimberly Crenshaw, but she coined the term. And to bring you back to it, she coined it through a legal analysis. She was looking at Black women in employment settings who weren't being covered by civil rights laws and weren't being sufficiently covered by laws that protect women, because being Black women gave them a unique form of experiencing multiple forms of oppression, right? Racism and sexism, both at the same time. Okay, so came to this PhD program, was kind of doing some dry disability analysis work for my PhD, and then I found out, as probably many of you will, if you're students of color and you go on to graduate programs, even at an undergrad level, I was one of the very few people in my graduate program who was a student of color, even though you look at me and you're like, that's like the whitest Latina ever. I shouldn't be this blonde, it's embarrassing. So I think, I feel like it's a benefit and burden, my time in graduate school. I am one of like a very small percentage of Latinas, and queer disabled Latina at that, to go to graduate school. So a lot of times, many of you maybe have experienced this, people want you to speak for like all people of color if no one else is in the room. And so, you know, you have that privilege and that opportunity, but it's also kind of a burden, because how can I possibly represent everyone? So I feel, in a sense, both good and bad, I was kind of pigeonholed into this work because I wasn't really thinking about immigration law when I started my PhD, but Trump got elected when I started my PhD, essentially, around that time. And immigrants were getting attacked left and right. And then this one case broke out. Her name was Rosa Maria. And it was the first year that Trump was in office. And it just splashed, it made all the headlines. She was like a 9-year-old girl with cerebral palsy. And she was on her way in the ambulance, going to the hospital to get like life-saving treatment for some kind of, you know, emergency surgery. And the ICE followed her behind her ambulance to the hospital. They went into the hospital and, you know, wouldn't let the doctors close the door, even though they should have. They didn't listen to the doctor's wishes that she needed to stay so much time to recover before throwing her into detention. And when this broke out in the news, it felt like this was the first time America was growing conscious that there were even disabled immigrants to begin with. And I think this pulled at a lot of people's heartstrings because she was, you know, a young 9-year-old girl, you know, with a disability, and there was more like the pity paradigm that, you know, how could we do this to a young disabled girl? But in fact, people with disabilities, or immigrants with disabilities, have always existed in the United States. But what I was trying to connect to with Rosa Maria was around that time, because I'm here at UIC, and they they said this in my intro, that I had helped start the National Coalition for Latinxes with Disabilities, which was an intersectional coalition that responded to the idea that disability is too white. If you guys don't know the hashtag disability too white by Lisa Thompson. And it was something that me and all my co-founders to the organization had experienced, not feeling like being in Latinx spaces, they were representing disability enough, and not being in disability spaces, we didn't feel like our Latinidad was being represented. So we created this group, and we meant to talk about, or we meant to do advocacy and community building around a whole host of issues, right? Like healthcare, education, employment, everything, right? Culture, identity. But when Rosa Maria broke out, our newly formed group that had only been around, I think, for like a year or less, started getting a lot of requests from news, from news outlets, from policy folks, from immigration firms, and they were asking us for comments on the Rosa Maria case and to talk about disabled immigrants, because it felt like with all these requests that people didn't know that disabled immigrants existed, and they didn't know what kind of protections they had under the law. So our coalition, I was with them for 4 years, recently left. For 4 years, we heavily focused on immigration because A, we were happy to, but B, really there was a need. And, you know, I don't necessarily feel like I'm the most qualified, you know, I don't necessarily feel like I'm the most knowledgeable. I think that I have a lot of privilege, again, like I said, being a light-skinned Latina, and a lot of educational privilege, a language privilege, you know, class privilege, et cetera, to be where I am in order to exist in some of these spaces. And that's why I've been fortunate in the last 4 years to enter a lot of policy and legal spaces where decisions are being made, and, you know, activists' plans are being drawn out, where I'm able to advocate for disabled immigrants. But all of this to say that it isn't sufficient that, you know, me and the few people who are doing this are out there. We need more folks, and as always, we need to center the folks who are having the lived experience. But one thing that was important to me as I continued in my advocacy was, we started a little late, so I get a little extra time, right? No? I love to talk.
Oh,
Go for it, okay.
I think if we switch to the dialogue version in
20 minutes, that's perfect. So one thing that was important to me as I was doing advocacy, you know, writing op-eds, doing podcasts, you know, holding vigils, you know, doing my advocacy and policy work around immigration was constantly talking to the immigrant community and asking, you know, can I represent you? Can I share your stories? And that was very important to me. And right after Rosa Maria, or in that same time period, in that same year, you know, Trump came in swinging, right? DACA was taken away. And for those of you who don't know, DACA is the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. I'm going to try to make this not too dry with the black and white letter of the law. But essentially, it provided a work permit, in some cases a driver's license, social security number, and it was an exercise of prosecutorial discretion to quote unquote low priority cases if folks had met certain guidelines. So you had to be under 31 years of age by June 15th, 2012. In the US, you had to come before you were 16 years old. So this was, you know, youth, young immigrants. You had to have continuously lived in the US, be currently in school or graduated from high school, or have a GED. And you couldn't have a felony or a significant misdemeanor or multiple misdemeanors. So that's what DACA was. And essentially, it just deferred that they would not put you as a priority for deportation. It didn't give you a pathway to a citizenship, as many of you probably know. So in September of 2012, as you know, Trump just ended DACA. For the 800,000 folks that were documented, they would not be able to reapply, although this quickly, and there's a lot of groups out there, including the ACLU, who have just really been on this administration, who quickly have responded, and they take a lot of these policy changes to court. And so we've been seeing some hope when these horrible decisions come down. And in this case, like DACA, we had an injunction in Texas. There were a few lawsuits in several places, but finally the Ninth Circuit ruled that essentially that the decision was arbitrary and capricious and that they couldn't do it. So currently now, folks can still continue to renew their DACA applications, which was a win, right? But they were not taking new applications, which is a huge loss for our community because, I don't remember the number, but I think it was there were hundreds of thousands of people more who did qualify and hadn't applied for DACA yet. So it was horrible for our community in that sense. And a few months ago, they announced that the Supreme Court was going to take up a DACA case. So they're going to be reviewing it in their January to June 2020 session. So the Supreme Court, for folks who, I won't get too much in the politics of that, but this is why presidents matter, and who we elect as a president, and why who they put on the Supreme Court matters, because big cases like these are being decided. So right now, I won't make any guesses, but right now the court is leaning, even though we say it's non-political, we all know it leans sort of into a more conservative bend. So we'll see what happens with DACA. But in the meantime, as you know, Trump put this to Congress and said, do your job, pass a law, blah, 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 but it's all politics. It was all grandstanding, knowing that he was trying to leverage at one point, like, give me funding for the border wall and I'll give you the Dreamer bill. And just really quickly, not to get too dry, but remember the DREAM Act, different than DACA, same category of folks, except there would be a pathway to citizenship. And so, as many of you have been aware of over the last couple of years, although I feel like we haven't been talking about it recently in Congress, they were once again trying to bring up a DREAM Act bill. So I have, over the past several years, been asked to talk about how does disability and immigration intersect? How is immigration even a disability issue? And I've gone through all the different laws and all the decisions, particularly in the Trump administration, that have passed, and said, look how they're affecting immigrants with disabilities, folks with disabilities, terrible conditions at detention centers, where folks don't have access to health care, family separation, which is causing all these children, a new generation of folks to have psychiatric disabilities like myself, or mental illness. And then more recently with the public charge, and I'll go more into what public charge is, very explicitly calls out people with disabilities. So I make that connection that way. And I feel like in other talks, I've been reflecting on this as I was coming here, that I've really spent the talk talking and focusing on how ableism exists in immigration policy and law. And we can see, the history of that, and I'll go a little into that as well, pending some time. But really, the more and more I think about it, the more and more I realized that you can't really separate the ableism from the racism in immigration law and policy. The more I learned about it, the more I realized it's just very intertwined. And for those of you who do study disability, disability history, we define disability in many ways, right? So the Americans with Disability Acts defines it as, including an impairment. So there's this, there's been like this dichotomy between disability and impairment. But we would, in the disability world, include folks who don't necessarily have impairments, but are categorized as disabled. And historically, this has been, has included communities of color, women, being hysterical, etc., immigrants. And so this is the case. And another thing that I've really reflected on too is that there is quite a difference too in the immigrant community, and maybe this is obvious, but I think it's important, and that is that immigrants with quote unquote disabilities often don't identify as being disabled or know that they're disabled, know that they have protections under the law. They don't identify as being part of a disability culture or community in the United States. And this is all very important because as much as the disability community we want them to come in and work in this space, it's just really important that the folks on the disability side really understand the racism aspect of it, understand the history of immigration, et cetera, because it's just so intertwined. And being culturally competent and understanding where these folks are coming from. I'm jumping around a little bit because I think I have a way longer speech than I have time for, but since I'm calling out the disability community, I'll just continue here. And for those of you who are tuned into sort of disability activism, recently, well, I would say in the last several years, just like we've had the hashtag for like 5+ years by Lissa Thompson created, Disability Too White, there has been a critique within the disability rights movement and disability activist spaces that disability is too white, that too many of the leaders are white men, for example, and not enough people of color. And this is where I think several folks kept saying disability justice, and I don't know if folks know the distinction between disability rights and disability justice, but disability justice was a concept coined by a group of disabled people of color, specifically queer disabled people of color, and includes different principles, but most notably that they wanted to center marginalized communities, people of color, in leadership within disability. It's also it's anti-capitalist. I mean, there's just, you know, a bunch of different principles to disability justice that distinguishes it from sort of the traditional disability rights movement and disability activism that have been going on. So this has been going on for several years, but this summer in particular, I think a lot of this is just very fomented because this administration has just really brought out, has made it acceptable for people to be more upfront about their racism. Do you guys kind of agree with that, right? It's not that like he brought racism to the United States, it's more like more people feel emboldened and comfortable. And if there's a good thing to this administration, it's that we've had the backlash and that a lot of folks have come together and coalesced, and you know, we've seen how strong our communities are confronting this. So within the disability activist community, I'm trying to make this as succinct as possible because for those of you who don't know the different players, there is a group called ADAPT, which is a very big, historically powerful part of the beginning of the disability rights movement in disability activist spaces, ADAPT. And they do a lot of protesting. They do a lot of civil disobedience as a way of protest. So these are the folks that you see who really made a difference when they were trying to get rid of Obamacare, for example. They went into, if you guys saw this in the news, they went to some people are shaking their head. They went to Congress, a lot of folks in wheelchairs, you know, and shut it down, and they get arrested. Okay, so ADAPT, very big historical group. And then also, there's something called independent living centers. Look that up if you don't know what it is. I don't have time. But independent living centers, there's one here called Access Living. They're throughout the United States, but there's a national organization that represents all of them, So the leader of NILC, which is the National Independent Living Center group, NILC, and also a leader in ADAPT, this summer was in Congress, in a congressional office doing his thing, actually representing ADAPT at that moment, even though he was the head of NILC. And he was on Facebook Live. You gotta be careful what you say now, everything gets recorded, which is why I pause a lot. But I'm gonna finish the story though, because I think it's important in terms of the politics within our activist community and even our policy community, because all of these things influence each other. So he was in a congressional office, on Facebook Live, and they were pushing for the DIA bill, which I don't have time to go into, but also a very noteworthy legislation that folks should look up, Disability Integration Act. So he was talking about this bill with a bunch of ADAPT folks, and at one point he says he's getting mad at the Democratic congressional staffers because they had just passed, or they had put up for a vote, a bill on immigration, or funding to protect, undocumented immigrants. And he says, you guys care more about, undocumented immigrants than you do about people with disabilities. And this is our national talking point. And at our conference next week, where Pelosi's going to do the keynote to open the conference, I'm going to confront her, and I'm going to say that you guys Democrats care more about immigrants than you do disabled people. Is that problematic? Intuitively, that's problematic, right? So that kind of talk happens all the time. But I think we're in a good space right now in our disability activist community, where people are no longer tolerating that and calling it out more and more. So by the next day, that person essentially, he resigned, he stepped down, but it was a forced removal from his position. And I'm not saying this to disparage this person or to, to disparage him, but I'm using him as an example that there's kind of hope within our disability activist community that these things are not acceptable. This week even, I heard another person in the disability movement, someone, I won't say who it is, but again, had the same kind of rhetoric that was saying, the civil rights community, they had their time. The feminist movement had their time. The LGBTQ movement has gotten their rights. They're good. It's just disabled folks' time. It is so dangerous, folks, to divide our communities like that, and to not recognize and to erase the folks who have multiple identities within each of these communities, right? So even though those are, difficult things to say, I think that they're important to be said, and that I appreciate folks who call out folks who are leaders in these positions, but pitting one group against the other, and not representing all disabled folks, right? And again, going back to disability justice, we want to continue to center the most marginalized folks. So, in conclusion, in my last 5 minutes, I'm just going to run through a little bit more legal stuff. Hopefully I won't bore you too much. To convince you, if you're not already convinced, that immigration law affects folks with disabilities. Ken Cuccinelli, he's the head of USCIS, which is USCIS, Immigration Service. Customs and Immigration Service, U.S. Customs and Immigration. Just last month, in August, I guess that was a couple months ago now, when he was asked about, what about the Statue of Liberty? There's the Emma Lazarus poem on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. It says, give me your tired, your poor, your humbled masses, yearning to breathe free, etc. They asked him about this, and his reply was, they asked him, is this part of the American ethos? And he says, well, yeah, certainly it is. Give me your tired, your poor, if they could stand on their own 2 feet and not become a public charge. That's what he said. And then when pressed about it, he said the Emma Lazarus poem was referring to Europeans who came from a class-based society. So there's a lot of instances like this where it's just, I feel like I don't even really have to make the case anymore. It's very explicit how ableism and racism is just so at the forefront of this administration's agenda. And I keep calling out this administration, but I mean, many of you know, we can critique the Obama administration, you know, the Bush administration, the Clinton administration, going all the way back, and race has always been a factor. I think it's a little bit easier to critique this one because they're so blatant with their criminality and their hatred. And also, too, proportionally speaking, they've just gone to ridiculous extremes. You know, I don't really need to reiterate Trump's rhetoric, you know, calling Mexicans criminals and drug dealers and rapists. That was from his campaign. The guy got elected. You know, he calls South American and African countries shithole countries. He said out loud that we should take more immigrants from places like Norway. So again, I bring that out to say that racism really is at the forefront of this. And Ken Cuccinelli, when he made that comment about the Emma Lazarus poem, he was responding to what is called the new public charge rule. And it's something that that finally got passed. Well, it was a rule, so finally got published in August of this year, so a couple months ago, and it's going to take effect on October 15th, which is just in 5 days. So I just really quickly wanted to talk about public charge, because it's actually not the most current attack against our community. There have been a couple other things that I want to talk about, but this is a really big one that has really affected immigrants with disabilities and will continue to affect immigrants with disabilities. So essentially, public charge rule is a new enforcing guidance of a rule that has existed since 1882. So the term public charge has been in our Immigration Act since the beginning that the Immigration Act has been around, right? And in the Immigration Act of 1882, they used terms like idiot, insane, pauper, or convict, person suffering from loathsome or a dangerous contagious disease, a felon, people with moral turpitude, polygamists. These were folks who were found to be public charge. So very explicitly, folks with disabilities, insane, idiot, contagious diseases were called out. The rule has different incantations throughout immigration history. So that was 1882, right? The first time we said we don't want people who are going to be public charges coming to the United States. So they were excluded. In 1915, the Supreme Court said that public charge is by reason of poverty, insanity, disease, disability, they explicitly use the word, who would become a charge upon the public. And again, not enough time to go into this, but this was all part of a project of eugenics, right? Folks know that around this time period, eugenics was a quote-unquote science, science that is being used as a way to improve the human species, obviously rooted very much in racism and ableism, et cetera. So there were different ways that eugenics policies were enacted, including sterilization, which really affected our community, but then also through these immigration laws. So this is all part of like a eugenics project. So public charge has been around for a while, and the modern use of the rule, pretty much in the pre-1990s, 17% of people applying to come into the U.S. were rejected on the public charge rule. But then during the Clinton and then more recently in the Obama years with the changing of the rule, it went down to 1% of people. So it wasn't really affecting that many people. But now, what happened was that the Trump administration, through the Department of Homeland Security, put out this, I think it was like 837-page guidance on what public charge should mean, making it incredibly easier for ICE, for immigration judges and immigration folks to decide and to find that someone is likely to become a public charge. So even though, like I said, it goes into effect on October 15th, and hopefully, like I said, through all these, ACLU and other organizations who really combat these types of things with litigation, et cetera, hopefully maybe we'll never see this come into play. It already had a negative impact on our community, and we think this is kind of intentional because, quote unquote, the public charge proposed rule was leaked as early as 2017 when Trump first came into office. And so they said it was, accidentally leaked, or it was like accidentally got out, but we think it's leaked, and this is all a project of imposing fear in our community, right? Imposing fear in the immigrant community. So even though this doesn't take effect until 5 days from now, over the last, year and a half since the leak of this proposed rule, there's been what we call a chilling effect. So folks who think that they are likely to become a public charge have been avoiding some of the programs. That if they used, they would likely to be seen as a public charge. And I think I need to define it first, so this makes more sense. In the previous public charge rule, basically if you were on SSI, so very disability specific, even pre to what we have now, if you were using SSI or if you were in long-term care, again, very disability specific, you were likely to be found a public charge. If you were gonna, if more than half of your income was gonna come from government, cash assistance, then you're going to be found a public charge. But now with the new rule, they also factor in if you are going to use non-cash government benefits, including Medicaid, housing assistance, which housing assistance is a big thing for a lot of undocumented immigrants, right? Like not only, well, what I was going to say is that, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say undocumented. I meant to say even though immigrants have this 5-year waiting period before they can even use a lot of these government benefits, the housing assistant part hits very hard because a lot of immigrants live with other folks who use like Section 8 housing or public housing assistance. So it's criminalizing these families who live together. And I made that distinction and I corrected myself, and that's something I should say too. Even though this is, again, 837 pages, and I can't possibly condense that all in the limited time that I have right now. I'm already gone way over time. But one thing I will note is that this pretty much extended, Trump's attack against immigrants from not only the undocumented immigrants, and that whole rhetoric of, we're taking care of the legals, and extending it to actual documented immigrants, because public charge affects folks who are here legally and who are documented immigrants and who are asking to get a green card or legal permanent resident status. It also applies to folks who are asking for visas to come into the United States. So now this attack is not only upon undocumented immigrants, but also folks who are here legally as well. There's been a lot of litigation on that, and I just wanted to say that the place that I work at, the Quello Center, we filed an amicus brief along with the ACLU and other disability organizations making disability claims, legal claims. So this is where my geeky legal side comes out. It was kind of cool that we're using the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504, and disability laws to make claims that this is an illegal law or that it's unconstitutional as well. So that, this kind of use of disability laws or disability arguments within the immigration space is sort of, it's more novel and not as frequently used. So it'll be interesting to see how this plays out in courts. I want to talk about 2 more policies. I know I've gone way over time. But recently also, in a couple of months ago, Trump got rid of non-military deferred action. Not to be confused with DACA, non-military deferred action essentially was deferred action for folks who had severe medical conditions or other non-medical cases, but they were like compelling circumstances that made their, which made them not a priority for deportation. So they basically got rid of that. And the way that we found out, the public found out about this, was that USCIS was sending letters to people who were applying for renewal of their deferred action. They were sending letters saying, we're not going to adjudicate your cases anymore. Like, we're not going to take up your cases. Basically, you're going to start getting deported. So again, these are folks with severe medical conditions who are here in the US, and they're getting deferred action because if they were to go back to their host countries, they don't have the same medical care that they have here. And essentially, they would die if they go back to their countries. So it came out in the news a couple months ago that these folks were getting letters and who had applied for deferred action, and that's how we found out the administration through USCIS was going to no longer renew these things. But of course, again, the hopeful part is that there was a backlash. 130 members of Congress, signed a letter, and there was just a lot of pressure from folks. And finally, USCIS said that they would reopen petitions that were taken in from August 7th, 2019, which again, kind of like the DACA thing, that was like a win for the community, but also what about after August 7th? Are they going to be taking requests for that? So another very explicit example of how disabled folks are being attacked through immigration policies. And I think I'll end in 2 minutes. I didn't really get into family separation, but as you guys can remember, Trump had the zero tolerance policy just a little over a year ago. It was supposedly between April 2018 and June 2018, so it was just a couple of months, right? That Trump enacted the zero tolerance policy where they essentially were not taking asylum claims, and they were charging adults and guardians and parents with criminal offenses for crossing the border, and therefore putting them in federal prisons, and thereby separating their children from them. And so these thousands of children, I think, the number kept going up, and at one point we heard like 2,000 and something children had been separated from their parents with no plan to reunite them, so separated and getting lost from their parents. But then we found out a year later that it wasn't just from April to June 2018. The administration had been doing that for like an entire year. And there were thousands of more children who had been removed. And currently, children are still getting removed from their parents. Even though, again, we took this to court, and a district court in California held that this was, I think, unconstitutional, or I don't remember the exact legal precedents there, but they said that they had to stop this, and not only that, but they had to reunite the children within 30 days. And then for kids that were like 2 years and younger, they had to reunite those children with their parents in 14 days. Did they do that? No, of course they couldn't do that because they had no plans, no system to reunite these children with their parents. So there are a lot of children who months and months and months, year after, still had not been reunited. And we continue to hear stories about folks who got deported back to their countries. So there was just no way that they were ever going to be reunited with their children. And really the last thing I wanted to mention was a little bit about the horrible conditions of the detention centers. When you have a DOJ attorney going up in court and arguing in front of a judge that soap and beds are not essential for immigrant children, that's not unconstitutional not to provide soap and beds, we have a problem. We have a humanitarian crisis. The American Immigration Council, Catholic Legal Immigration Network, surveyed 200 detained families, and they just recently released a report. And some of the findings included that 35%, that the parents said that 35% of the children there, that the children that they had brought over, their health worsened in detention centers. 58% of mothers surveyed had requested medical care for children but didn't receive any medical care. We found out examples like this, like there's detention center policies that a child has to vomit 3 times before receiving any medical care. So there was a story of a 9-year-old girl who had vomited twice, so she couldn't get medical care. But this girl, this daughter, this 9-year-old, had cysts that prevent her kidneys from working properly. So a doctor had said, you know, she needs to bathe and change her underwear daily, right, to prevent infections. Well, CBP had not given her clean underwear and had not allowed her to bathe for 5 days. So that's why she had vomited twice, but still couldn't receive the care because of the 3 vomit policy rule. There was another instance where a woman witnessed CBP taking another woman who was pregnant to give birth at a hospital, and then when she came back, the woman was essentially forced to put her infant on a cold concrete floor with only the Mylar sheet in between the concrete floor and her newborn infant. So, you know, we keep finding out about more and more of these just disgusting, horrible, inhumane conditions. And again, why is it even so revolutionary that we're hearing these stories now? It's because, as you know, the administration and ICE has made it very difficult for folks to go into detention centers. You may remember a few months ago, they pretty much did not let even congressional leaders get into detention centers. I was going to talk about the raids, but we all know raids happen. And I wanted to end with, again, we need, in the very beginning, what I said is we need to center the folks' stories. Even though these statistics are very jarring, I think it's always important that we tell the stories of folks and humanize this, because a lot of times we just hear all these statistics and it just almost becomes, you know, just a policy issue, just a numbers game, and we lose the human component to it. So I think it's important that we continue to share our stories. So there's this project called Project Amplify, and they've been interviewing kids who are in detention centers, and I'll just read a few of their quotes. So this 12-year-old girl says, "There were over 30 to 40 children where I was. It was very cold. All the walls were metal fences, like a kennel for animals. They separated me from my mother. She asked them not to separate us, but they ignored her. I kept crying and felt very depressed. It was the worst experience of my life." A 16-year-old from Honduras said, "I have been here 11 days. I haven't had a shower the whole time I have been here. 2 times I was allowed to brush my teeth." Marciela, 11 years old, "One time a staff member put her 2 thumbs up to my throat and her hands around my neck. I felt scared." And Alma, 16, from Mexico, "I am in a room with 50 people. There is not enough room for everyone to sleep at the same time. People put their mats in the bathroom. It is difficult to sleep." Thank you all. I've grossly went over time, and we wanted to have sort of a Q&A session. Can we still have that?
Yes, so I will be passing this microphone around if folks have questions or comments around the presentation, especially for Katherine.
Thank you so much for linking immigration and disability. But first, we'll hear from Lily.
Hi, everyone. My name is Lily. I'm the program coordinator from the Disability Cultural Center. And just so you all know, I identify as a disabled immigrant woman. We are here, definitely want to hear your questions, but also we want to encourage dialogue amongst all of you here. So we also do want to hear your questions, but please, we encourage you to dialogue with us as well if we pose some questions to you. So are there any burning questions right now?
Or maybe just reflections on what you've heard?
My name is Hugo Trevino. I work for the Disability Resource Center. I am a child of immigrant parents. And hearing all of this was amazing, but it just made me like dizzy, kind of like hearing it. It's so crazy and like really depressing to hear this. Is there anything that you can kind of like suggest of like how we can like fight back? Because I feel like throughout this entire administration, it's been like draining. Like, I don't know, I feel like I know a lot about these stories and like how you said a lot about the policies, but how you humanize it, I feel like it hits a little bit harder. So I don't know, just kind of.
Do you have a responsibility or should I jump in?
No, go ahead.
Keep doing what you're doing. Like I said, folks have been organizing, calling their reps. An election is coming up next year. And voting's important. I know maybe we've grown a little cynical. I've grown a little cynical, but I keep reminding myself that voting is important, and that we could have change potentially in a year. In the meantime, we have a lot of these lawsuits that are out right now, so there is some hope with the lawsuits. One thing that I didn't say, but I wanted to say that I am personally doing in my continued advocacy. I now don't really work at an activist level anymore because I don't work with the National Coalition for Latinx with Disabilities anymore. I left the group after 4 years, although I'm still co-founder. I do more policy work, and I was at an immigration summit just last week, and it was mostly with immigration attorneys and immigration policy folks. And one of the big recurring things that I kept hearing over and over was they were like, we need training on disability law and disability issues because immigration attorneys get disabled clients or are getting these instances where folks are becoming disabled or having these stories, right, that they can actually bring out in their cases, but they don't know how to because they've never really worked with disabled folks. So we're now planning to put together like a training for immigration attorneys across the United States next year in Los Angeles in order to give them sort of a rundown on working with disabled clients and using disability laws such as like the Americans with Disability Act, et cetera. So that's something that I'm working on over this next year.
Would anyone like to share kind of a reflection on anything that they may have found surprising that they didn't know about disability and immigration and the way they may intersect?
Do you have a mic?
So I knew that once the Trump administration started, that it was like the intersectionality between immigrants who were here undocumented and disability was very high. So they were kind of first priority to get deported, but I didn't know that it had extended over to documented immigrants who were already protected, but their protection kind of like reversed in a way. I know like earlier, like when the Trump administration first started, I was actually helping out residents who wanted to apply for citizenship who were immigrants, and I came across one woman who was disabled, and I didn't know how to approach the situation because like I'm studying disability and I'm studying like working with like Latino communities, and I didn't really know like how to approach that. And I know that a lot of people with disabilities in the Latino community have a hard time identifying or claiming their disability. So I don't know if you have like any suggestions on like how to give them like a peace of mind, or to like let them know that there's people who are actually like supporting them or like cheering them on.
Well, first of all, thank you for the work that you do. It's so important, and we need more people like you. I mean, I'm assuming you're Latina?
Yeah.
Okay. What's that?
A lot of people always think I'm white too. No,
Oh, yeah. I got it. Really, just thank you for what you're doing. I think it's important. Yeah, I mean, that's difficult. I've thought a lot about that as well. How to work with Latinx families of color, with talking about disability. It's a little more difficult. I think it's just, being sensitive to how people identify and meeting them there. I think we have a lot of discussion about like language, particularly like in disability studies or in disability spaces. But when you get out into the real world, you have to be flexible. And really, when you're working with people, you just, again, have to meet them where they are. So some folks, use different language to identify their disability. You don't have to impose on them this disability culture and language that they don't know about. Poco a poco, right? We can introduce them to those kinds of things. I don't know if that's helpful, but that was my first thought. Did you have anything with working with Latinx families?
I was just going to say also thinking about how is it that we can build capacity within our own disability and immigrant communities to be able to talk about these issues, so it's not just a select few, right? So if you all either identify or want to be allies, that's why I think it's so important to really have these community spaces, these dialogues, these presentations, so we could all learn more. Yeah. Does anyone want to share any other things they've been thinking about?
Hi, Lily. This is Yuri.
Hi.
Yeah. And also I use the they them pronoun. Katherine, I really appreciate how you briefly elaborated how the disabled immigrants are impacted by this racist and ableist immigration system, but also you explained so well how the immigrants of color are become disabled by this oppressive system. Yeah, and also going back to the Nickel incident. Nickel is the National Council of Independent Living. You briefly mentioned about the incident. And that incident broke my heart as an disabled immigrant who was scheduled to be an intern for the organization. But yeah, and I've been keep thinking of whether I should withdraw my plan or not. But I already spoke with my academic advisor and everything, so I couldn't change. Anyway, but I was wondering whether you have any advice for the immigrants of color who are working with predominantly white disability organizations.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, I mean, burnout is real. I think more than anything, I'm here to witness what you're going through, and I empathize. And again, I have privilege being a lighter skinned Latina, so I can navigate spaces and probably hear a lot of more things than other folks here, and don't experience very overt forms of racism in these spaces. But I definitely can empathize with the burnout from the lack of understanding of racism within the disability community. But you're asking for advice. I mean, my advice is just, I hate just saying self-care. That's just so easy. But self-care, community care, taking time for yourself, finding your tribe. I've really existing in disability spaces have had to not only find but cultivate my inner circles, knowing the people who I can trust and who I can commiserate with and who I can strategize with, and that really has gotten me through it. Sadly, I think one of the bigger things for me getting through a lot of this is kind of staying away from social media and staying away from a lot of the arguing within the disability activist community back and forth. I don't know if that's good advice or not, but that's the way I've coped, because it becomes very overwhelming, and I constantly have to keep telling myself, focus on the things that you're doing to make it a better place, and ignore the chatter all around you. And I know that's easier said than done, but it's the only way that I continue in this space, is really tuning people out, just sticking to what I believe in and moving forward. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Denise, and so I actually have a older sister. She's about 27 years old right now, and she's undocumented. And I remember maybe 6 years ago, she was paralyzed because of like gun violence, and I remember that it was like super hard to like sorry. That's okay. To like just find services, you know, for undocumented people. And look, so, sorry. So I want to know, like, how are you guys reaching out to, like, you know, these immigrant communities, or what are your next steps for this? Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. I'm sure my answers are incredibly frustrating because I don't have all the answers, but you reminded me of a lot of stories that I've been hearing that are similar to yours and your sister's. Sister or brother? Sister. Your sister's. I think I was trying to say this, and then I always get confused with what I'm saying whenever I'm speaking. But when DACA was rescinded by the administration, I interviewed, I think around 10 people who were either disabled immigrants who were documented or DACA eligible, or I think there were like a couple of siblings. And one thing that I found over and over again was a story that you told, or similar to that, was that even DACA itself was not sufficient for people with disabilities who got DACA or were DACA eligible, because they still had to confront ableism. They still had, even if they had a work permit, they still couldn't get a job. So how the heck was DACA helping them? And then even I heard stories that there were DACA eligible folks, but couldn't even get into an immigration office because the immigration office wasn't accessible. So, I mean, maybe this isn't sufficient, but I feel like in my own way, what am I doing? I mean, when that happened and folks, again, we're talking about, you know, bringing up the narrative like, oh, how could we be doing this to DACA students, like, and bringing up the proposals of the DREAM Act. I went out there and I kept saying, we need to critique these laws because they're not even sufficient, because they're not even covering people with disabilities, and there's ableism inherent in these laws that we're pushing forward. And a lot of other groups have been doing sort of this advocacy around like the DREAM Act and DACA as well. And it's the folks who, you've probably heard of folks who say, like, we shouldn't be creating this dichotomy between like people who merit, you know, the good immigrants versus the bad immigrants. You know, the people who came here through no fault of their own versus we criminalize their parents, or young children versus older. So in the same vein, I think those kind of critiques on these kind of laws within our community, like within the immigration community, telling those stories, I mean, maybe it probably doesn't feel comforting, but it really is a big first step. Like, you sharing your story is so important. Your sister's story is important. Again, I'm more at a policy level now. So I'm, like I said, the next big thing I have coming up is I'm reaching out to folks in the immigration world to make them more conscious about disability. Again, I'm sorry, I know that's not anywhere near sufficient. We have a lot of work to do.
Do you want to talk about the summit we attended together?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned it. That's what I was saying, like last week we were at a summit, Lily and I were both there. And that's where I said that there were a lot of immigration folks, both attorneys and advocates. And like one recurring thing over and over we kept hearing was they were like, didn't know anything about disability law. Like I was on a couple of panels, and the first panel I was on was just talking about the Americans with Disabilities Act. Like I was just like saying like, this is the ADA, this is what the ADA does. And I was like asking the hosts, you know, like, is this too basic? And no, it wasn't, because a lot of immigration attorneys like don't even know. And again, it just goes back to like, we've been so siloed in the social justice work that we do that we don't realize, like even from like an attorney perspective, that we have multiple tools in our toolbox, you know? So again, that's why I kind of geek out when I see these recent lawsuits like against public charge, for example, that are using these disability theories, because this is like very new stuff. I also want to caution too, ADA is not like the big fix-all. Like we have way more work to do beyond ADA. But it'll be interesting to see how far we can extend the ADA.
This isn't really like a question or anything like that, but I just find it very refreshing having something like this being brought up, because I don't go here. I go to Southern Illinois and University in Carbondale. I'm just here visiting and stuff, but we don't have stuff like this talked about down there, and we don't have, regardless of whatever's happening down there, it doesn't get talked about. And it is here, and it's just very refreshing to see that it's important and people find it important. And like there were so many people here, like, I don't know. I just wanted to say thank you for like talking about it and stuff.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for sticking around and for being here and for taking interest in the subject, but also in people's humanity, and know that the Latino Cultural Center, as well as the Disability Cultural Center, and in general, we have 7 centers for cultural understanding and social change here at UIC that really care about all of our students, regardless of how you may identify. And so if you ever need any kind of support, feel free to reach out to come by. And here's the Disability Resource Center as well. And so just know that there's support on campus for students and community members too. So thank you.
So my name's Kimberly Martinez, and I identify as non-disabled, but I am gonna major in disability and human development. So I think you talked about public charge and Medicaid and everything, and it's it's okay. I understand. I recently have been going through I have Medicaid now, but how you made it sound, it's like it makes me feel like how even the thing says public charge, I feel like I'm bothered for them. Even if I don't have a disability or a medical issue, it's really hard nowadays to have an insurance where you're able to afford. Both of my parents are undocumented, they're from Mexico, and for my father to pay an insurance, he would have to basically spend his whole paycheck in order to just afford an insurance for himself. So I'm just even if it's not oh, I don't have a disability, it's still an issue. It's still an issue where no one is able to have help. It's almost seen as the government does not want to help us at all. Mm-hmm. It's all I feel it's all for their benefit in a way. Because it's we're not able to even ask for help or anything, or else we're already seen as a bother. So it's really heartbreaking, because it's okay, so now I'm a bother for them. Imagine how just I don't know, when I see it, it's I have a disabled cousin in Mexico, he has it even worse. So I'm just I don't know if at times it's also me okay, I think I shouldn't be asking for Medicaid, because it's at times I feel there's more people who need more help than I do, and then I'm just oh, I'm just a bother, but I don't think at times they see the situation of immigrant families and everything, and us who were born here in the United States, it's also an issue for us. So it's there's this cycle of issues between of course public charge and everything. So it's when you talked about that, I really felt it, and it's good to know that there's people who are trying to work on that. And yeah.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, everything you said is just so on point. I mean, I wish we need to publish like what you just said. That was just put so well. I even feel like people who are anti the new public charge rule, like I've listened to a bunch of folks talk about it, and they still talk about it like very problematically about there's like this inherent assumption, which is essentially ableism, right? That like people with disabilities or people who are going to be public charges, likely become public charges, like are a negative thing in the United States. And again, it just goes like to like the social model of disability versus the medical model of disability kind of thing. But you're pointing out like this is a like systemic issue that like disables our communities and our families. That keeps us poor, that keeps us uninsured, that creates disability within our families. And then the rhetoric is of this our fault, it's our shortcomings. That's not really an answer, that's just, I mean, I feel you. That was put so well, thank you. So, wait, I think this was it, what I was saying. So we really, again, this is why I think, even though we need to talk about ableism and racism, you know, as being something that works together in this immigration space, again, just even talking about ableism is like revolutionary and is really going to speak to a lot of these issues. Thanks for sticking around, everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you again to the Latino Cultural Center and the Disability Cultural Center. This was such an honor. Thank you for inviting me out here. You could Google me and find my contact online. Otherwise, it's Katherine.Perez@lls.edu. I'm happy to chat with folks.
So make sure that you follow Katherine on social media and that you also follow the Disability Cultural Center and the Latino Cultural Center on Instagram and all social media platforms. You were also given an evaluation form. We will be collecting those in the front. If you didn't get one, there's also an online evaluation form for you. So thank you for being here.